got a little bit of picolares, a few things to kind of calm your stomach down for a little while. So I want to welcome you to our event today. I am Iris Zavala Martinez, a distinguished lecturer at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. I'm a psychologist. And I want to present, today's a very special presentation for me because I have an interesting history with this pair. And I am very happy to present them. So let's start. First, David Forbes is an associate professor of education at the School of School Counseling at Brooklyn College. But I think what I'm more interested in talking about David is kinds of interesting things that he's done, his praxis. He integrates things like counseling with mindfulness, social justice. He uses the word integral to kind of define the kinds of focuses that he wishes to have. He is intent on challenging what it is to be a school counselor, so to increase and improve community service. So I think we have before us a school counselor who is really preparing our youth to really become integral, mindful, creative school counselors for the needs. So I commend you. I really find that looking at your CV, I said, it must be good and interesting to be in your classes, David. And I have known David and Iris for some years. So let's talk to the other part, Iris. Iris probably doesn't know that I know that her middle name is Ophelia. Iris Ophelia López. Iris is a professor of sociology at the City University of New York. She's the director right now, co-director, right? Mm-hmm. Unless the faculty page is wrong. Latino, Latin American Latino Studies at City College. And she has her degree from university, where it's not even here, Iris.
Columbia University.
Columbia University. And Iris and I met many years ago. We were both graduate students. I don't think I've repeated this since a long time. We were at the Institute of Social Research at Ann Arbor, the summer of 1981, 81? It was the summer of 1981. We had both gotten some scholarships. I was coming from UCLA. I was doing my doctorate in clinical psychology. She was doing her doctorate in sociology, and I met her at the Institute of Social Research, so we have had some contact over the years. But Iris went on to finish her work and did some really stellar work in looking at sterilization in Puerto Rican women, which, if you don't know, has been a disastrous situation, of which they made a wonderful film many years ago called La Operación, de Ana Maria Garcia, made a film on the abuses of sterilization, and Puerto Rican women are amongst the women that are most sterilized in the world. And this has been part of she wrote a book, Matters of Choice, some years ago, and worked on issues of women in women's studies and in Latina. She's also one of the contributors, I don't think she knows I know this, but I read it some years ago, of Los Testimonios, Latina women testimonies, and using narratives. And both of them together have been working at looking at and recovering the history of the Puerto Ricans in Hawaii. I want to read just something very briefly, because this book has a history too. It says, and I will quickly translate, just 3 lines. El país, amigo mío, huyendo de males tan terribles, continúa desangrándose en gran sumo, pues las emigraciones aumentan de día en día hasta el extremo de que el periodo transcurrido de 2 meses han desaparecido del terruño cerca de 6,000 almas con destino a Hawaii. This book, which she was already interested in Hawaii, when I found out a couple years ago that she was working in Hawaii, says, oh, I have a great book on Hawaii that I've had for a couple years, since 1983. And this book talks about the history of the migrations. It's published in 1983. And it's called, by a historian, Puerto Rican historian, Éxodo puertorriqueño, las emigraciones del Caribe a Hawaii in 1900 and 1910. And it's one of the few and probably the earliest history of this historian that tried to gather the history, not only the Hawaiians, he was doing some research for looking at what had happened to the Puerto Ricans, the diaspora. So the phrase I just read to you though, really repeats itself. Not only then, but the diaspora continues. The flight from Puerto Rico continues year after year. The Hawaiian probably was the first, as we will find out. So both Iris and David have joined together to study and write about and discover the history of the diaspora. And I just want to say one thing about this, because I think that this is not just a labor of academics. This is a labor of love. Because to recover history, to discover history, and this kind of history of Boricuas who left, who were prompt to leave Puerto Rico so many years ago, and to try to reclaim that history, is also a way of ensuring that our collective memory of the Puerto Rican diaspora, our collective memory of the Boricuas, can be understood, can be honored, and continued. So with those words of collective memory, I welcome, and may we start with Iris and David.
Thank you, everyone. And I just like to start by saying aloha, since it just seems appropriate in this context. But before we get started with our presentation, I'd like to thank Iris Zavala for such a beautiful introduction, the director, Edwin Melendez, for having us, and everyone else who has been here and has helped us along the way. Mayra isn't here, but she's been very helpful, Evelyn Collazo, and Jose Camacho, just to name a few. We were funded in part by the Centro to do this research for this past year. We were also funded by the Hawaii Council of the Humanities and by PSC CUNY. These were all small grants, but this is how we've been doing this research with the help of friends, and it's really been piecemeal, flying to Hawaii when we can, spending as much time as we can there, and working like crazy, even though it sounds sort of like a contradiction to go to Hawaii and work like crazy. But when you're so far away, you feel you have to take advantage of every minute. And we've been doing this now, David and I, my husband, for at least 10 years. And so it's been an ongoing process. And I started it. He became involved, and so now we're working on this together. We're really collaborating. And I just want to recognize also, before I get started, that the director of the wonderful play Aloha Boricua is here with us, and his friends and partner. And we really appreciate that. We were so inspired by your play that we hope you don't mind, used part of the of your poster for the poster the Centro sent around. And so we did it really in honor of you, because when we went to Hawaii this past year, we took news about this wonderful play that was taking place here in New York. And they were so impressed and wanted to hear about it. And you were kind enough to lend us and certain clips and stuff that we showed when we created this community program in conjunction with Nancy Ortiz and the people there, and we're going to show that at the end. But before we do, let me just give you a little introduction, some of the questions that our study raised. And this is a work in progress, so we are still answering questions ourselves. Our first burning questions really were, how did Puerto Ricans end up in Hawaii? And I guess I should how are their experiences similar or different to the other ethnic groups there? How did the Hawaii Sugar Plantation Association create ethnic hierarchies in Hawaii? How do Puerto Ricans today construct and negotiate their ethnicity in a uniquely multicultural society? Are Puerto Ricans assimilating, or are they redefining who they are? And what are current trends in terms of Puerto Ricans in Hawaii, and what does their future look like? These are just some of the questions we hope to touch upon. We're not going to be able to get into great detail about everything, but at least this is basically an overview. As I mentioned, we started this research, and I actually started this research in 1995. I did a postdoctorate at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and that's when I started to meet the Puerto Ricans that were there. And it was just the very beginning, my introduction to this community. I met people like Norma Carr and Blaise Sousa Camacho and Austin Diaz and Nancy Ortiz and many others that really impressed me. But the people that really impressed me were like the average person who, after being in Hawaii for over 100 years, was still identifying very strongly as Puerto Riqueño. And I wanted to understand that. I'm an anthropologist by training, even though I am in the sociology department. And so I started out at UPRA, the United Puerto Rican Association, and they introduced me to some families, and I snowballed. And that's how, so people introduced us to other people. And I could say that in the past 10 years, David and I have worked intensively with about 8 families on an intergenerational basis. So that's 3 generations in each family, maybe more. So these are just some of the, that's just the methodology. I'm a little, okay. So the first question, how did Puerto Ricans end up in Hawaii? Of course, 1898, Puerto Rico becomes a colony of the United States. The Hurricane San Ciriaco. The HSPA, the Hawaii Sugar Plantation Association, recruited Puerto Ricans to Hawaii. Who are they? The HSPA, and I'm going to refer to them that way from this point on, are a very important group of family. They were known as the Big Five, and their descendants were the British missionaries who went to Hawaii to missionize, to sort of, in quotes, civilize the workers. And in 1882, as a result of the Chinese Exclusion Act that prohibited Japanese and Chinese from entering the United States, they went to Puerto Rico to recruit workers for the sugar cane that was, at this point, still in its stages of development, but growing. The voyage took place from Guanica to New Orleans, San Francisco, and Hawaii. And here's a little map. I'm sorry, it's not a good map. But you can see Puerto Rico, and then you can see over here where Honolulu is and how isolated and what this journey actually looked like for people. They started out on a ship, and then they went from here to San Francisco on rail, and then another ship. And Nitza Medina wrote a wonderful dissertation, if anyone is interested in reading it, about that voyage, and Aloha Boricua did a beautiful job in presenting it, the hardship, the difficulties, how people, the Puerto Ricans that went, how they tried to run away, at least by the time they got to San Francisco, because of the really cruel and difficult conditions on that voyage. And it was, they really resisted the HSPA or those recruiters that accompanied them, sometimes at gunpoint, so that they wouldn't resist. Because of course they didn't want more. About half of the Puerto Ricans ran away on the first trip, and the first trip there were probably about 2,500 on the very first voyage. And of course they didn't want to lose their money that they had already invested in terms of the ship and everything else. And so they kind of kept the rest of the Puerto Ricans, excuse me, hostage. And because Puerto Ricans resisted on that trip, they acquired a very negative representation, or I should say a very negative representation was constructed of them. Mm-hmm. Now, I'll go back to that negative representation in a minute, but let me just say that when Puerto Ricans first arrived in Hawaii, they were registered by the Portuguese. The Portuguese last names and the Spanish last names are very similar. So because they were the ones registering them, they changed people's names from like Gomez to Gomes, Rodriguez to Rodrigues, Caraballo to Caraballo, Vargas to Valga, Lopez to Lopes, Robles to Roble. You get the idea. So today, when you meet people with these last names, many of them are Puerto Rican and not Portuguese, or maybe they're mixed because there's been a lot of intermarriage. So that was the very first part, and of course they also distribute them. They distributed them to the different islands in Hawaii, and there are about 5 of these islands. But Maui and the Big Island and Oahu were the main places where they had plantations. One of the strategies that the HSPA used was to mix people up, the different ethnic groups, so that they couldn't understand each other. They didn't want them to understand each other, to be able to communicate, because they didn't want them to organize. And so, so that was one of the issues. And they also separated families that led Puerto Ricans to move from plantation to plantation in search of their families later on. And I'm going to get into this in more detail in a minute. Because of this social and cultural isolation, people had no choice but to invent a new language called Pidgin. And this probably happened over the course of a generation, maybe 2, where people just started to try and come up with common words for the same thing. And that's the Pidgin. That is a real language. It's an accepted language that they use today, probably similar to Creole and Patois. Now, how were the experiences of Puerto Ricans different from other ethnic groups? 4 factors distinguish them, and I'm going to get into each one of these. A, the HSPA constructed a negative image of them. B, Puerto Ricans were recruited as strike breakers, and that was very important in terms of how they were received. C, they were not contract laborers. And D, Puerto Ricans became U.S. citizens in 1917. So let's see what this looks like. A, negative representation of Puerto Ricans in Hawaii. As I said, the voyage was harsh. Half of the Puerto Ricans on the first voyage escaped. They organized, and when they arrived in Hawaii on that last ship, they were fed food in a trough. And I mean, at that point, they completely rebelled and took over the ship. Even though they were half-starved, really had very little clothing, very few things that they could call their own, but they had a great deal of pride. And they refused to be treated like animals, and that's how they were being treated. So as I said, as a result, as soon as they arrived in Honolulu, the HSPA started to contact their editors in the Honolulu Advertiser and write these very negative stories and say that Puerto Ricans were criminals and that they were, part of the underground and et cetera, et cetera. Puerto Ricans were recruited as strike breakers. Because of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, the recruiters brought them in hopes of disbanding the ways that the Japanese and the Chinese had organized on the plantations already. The Japanese and Chinese were the first to immigrate to Hawaii a generation earlier, let's say in the 19th century, late 19th century. And so by the time Puerto Ricans arrived, they had been there for 1 generation, 1.5 generations. And so the HSPC threatened Puerto Ricans by saying, threatened the Japanese and the Chinese by telling them if they continued to strike, they would continue to bring in Puerto Ricans and they would lose their jobs. So, of course, this didn't sit well with the Asians that were there and didn't make Puerto Ricans very popular, besides the fact that no one spoke the same language and could understand each other, etc. Puerto Ricans were not contract laborers, contrary to what a lot of people think. This is important because Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines became a territory of the United States in 1898. Once that happened, contract labor became illegal. that's the time that Puerto Ricans immigrated, and that's why they had more mobility than the Asians who were there before them, who were literally serfs of the land. I mean, they were bought there, they had these contracts 5 to 10 years, they couldn't move from the plantations. If they did, they could be horsewhipped, they could be killed. I mean, the HSPA controlled everyone, the courts, the jury, the judges. It was, you know, Hawaii was like their fiefdom, and they did what they wanted up until 1959, that it became a state. 1917, Puerto Ricans, everybody knows that here, became U.S. citizens. In Hawaii, this did not automatically give them rights. The HSPA did everything they could not to allow Puerto Ricans to vote. But this man, Manuel ODB Sanchez, fought for the rights. He was just a court interpreter, but he fought for the rights of Puerto Ricans to vote, and they were given that right. Here's a photo of him. I'm sorry, I didn't do a very good job of scanning, but this is him in the 30s. But of course, he was a younger man when he fought this fight, along with others. The divide and conquer and the creation of ethnic hierarchies in Hawaii. The main strategy that the HSPA used was keeping people isolated and in competition with one another, which meant that they paid Puerto Ricans a little bit more than they paid the Japanese and the Chinese. And then later on, when the others came, they paid them a little bit more, and that's basically the way they kept them at each other's throats. They also understood the habits and the beliefs of the Japanese and their baths, ritual baths, and the baths that they took every day. And they also understood how Catholic Puerto Ricans were. So what did they do? They put them in the same plantation, one community right next to the other, so that when the Japanese had to, you know, go to their baths, they had to pass through the Puerto Rican camp, which of course then caused an uproar, tiny riots initially, until people got to know each other and understand each other better and become, you know, have more solidarity. This actually caused problems, and it was done on purpose. I'm going to mention the kachi-kachi music here because it is related to what I was just talking about, this animosity between the Japanese and the Puerto Ricans there. Kachi-kachi is known as the Jibaro music, right? That's the locals, everybody uses that term there. Puerto Ricans use it, everybody uses it. But there's a double entendre to the kachi-kachi. It also means to cut. And so when the Japanese use it, they're saying kachi-kachi music, Jibaro music, but also fights and knives and, you know, riots. I'm going to read you a quote here that John Colon, what he said to me, and this is kind of a popular folklore at this point. Puerto Ricans love to relax on Sundays after working 6 days a week on the sugar plantation. At these parties, they cooked, sang, and danced. All of the neighbors were invited. Sometimes at one of these parties, a fight would break out and a Puerto Rican would pull out a knife and try to cut somebody. And so they associated the music, the dance, the cutting, and, you know, to the 21st century, people mention this. So it's kind of interesting that it's been maintained for so long. I have to keep an eye on the time here. Okay, so I have a couple of quotes. Maybe I'll skip some of them, you know, because of time, but I'll just read one more. This is Uncle Manny. He said, Puerto Ricans have hot tempers and stuff. But basically, to give you the gist, I don't have to read it. What he's saying is that Puerto Ricans would not take anything from anybody, even when they were half starved and stuff. They had a fighting spirit, and they weren't used to being pushed around, so to speak. And so, you know, he said that he tells a story that once a foreman tried to. They used to, when someone was sick, they weren't given sick days. The foreman would go into their barracks and literally pull them out by the hair, the Japanese, even if they were sick, even if they had fevers, regardless. And once he said that they did that to a Puerto Rican, and the Puerto Rican would sleep with a machete under his under his blanket, and he took out his machete, and that was the last time it happened. And he said it with such a sense of pride that, and I mean, and these are stories that are still circulating today, you know, in the 21st century. And I thought that that's interesting too, that people still have these memories and these collective memories, which I think is so interesting. Anyway, I'll skip this one. And I'll get to how plantations have changed. And of course, this study is an intergenerational study. And so, you know, we're talking about the immigrants who came in the early part of the 20th century. And then we're talking about, you know, their sons and daughters, the first and second generation, learning a new language, becoming part of local culture that David will talk about. You know, and how the plantations evolved and changed too, even though they were still pretty horrible. And the company was the one that basically, you know, they ran everything. And Austin Diaz here at the end, right here, he said, it was a hard life with very low wages. The workers' life was completely controlled by the company. This is in the 50s. We depended on the plantation for everything: wages, housing, medical treatment, entertainment, food. The management, feudal lords, were respected and distant. While I have fond memories of the camaraderie in growing up on a plantation, the complete economic dependence on the company made it a life with no future. My parents relocated to California so they could afford to send me to college. And although there is no doubt that given the exorbitant prices in Hawaii today, a job that includes free housing, food, and other basic necessities would have mass appeal to many people, how attractive it is depends on a person's aspirations and present socioeconomic status. So I mean, we want to talk about this. I want to put this presentation into context into 3 levels, even though there are artificial levels that really are integrated, but just in terms of talking about it: ethnic culture, local culture, and then global culture. And that's basically the way the time has passed to the early plantations, so it's sort of the mid-50s, and then, you know, the late 20th century into the 21st century. Well, there are no more plantations today anyway. And this is the last slide that I'll talk about, just the Puerto Rican organizations. They developed between 1931 and 1932, and the reason why they were so important is because Puerto Ricans, even up until 1931, had a very negative representation in Hawaii. People thought of Puerto Ricans there as, you know, they only, whenever the newspapers published something about them, it was something negative, some crime or some bad thing that had happened that Puerto Ricans were involved in. And so these first and second generation local Puerto Ricans, what they did is they organized the Puerto Rican Civic Club and the Puerto Rican Independent Association. Okay, later on, those became UPRA. They merged in 1973. But this is, in this early period, they played a pivotal role in terms of changing the view and the what's the word I'm looking for? Changing the representation or the way people were seen. The image. Thank you. The image. So I'm going to turn it over to David. I'm going to change seats with him.
You want to do that? Okay.
Excuse me. So that he can push his own button. Okay.
I push her button too.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, where
Just
are
that one
we?
there.
Okay. We're gonna do an all too brief, very brief, almost superficial mention of Puerto Rican culture in Hawaii. And the first thing that, I mean, some of these really have an impact on local culture, which is a source of pride for the local Puerto Ricans, but the cuisine is definitely still around. There's actually a pastele shop. It's not run by Puerto Ricans, but there's an interesting story about how the woman who began it was on a plantation and knew had an auntie, or and she learned the recipe for pasteles, and they've creatively use the local ingredients from Hawaii, and they make pasteles, and they make them all year round. I mean, my understanding is it's generally a special event for Christmas, but you can go into the pasteli shop anytime and get pasteles. But they call it ganduli rice. They have bacalao salad. And I'm sorry we don't have it, right? We don't have the Julia Robley. There's a cookbook, a wonderful cookbook.
We'll see it in the video.
Yeah, you see it in the video, but you could order it from UPRA. It's a Puerto Rican cookbook from Hawaii. So again, they put together all the good the recipes from they collected oral histories and recipes from all the great cooks in Hawaii, the Puerto Rican cooks. So the cuisine is still there. It's vibrant. It's we have other friends there that started making their own pasteles, right? And they sell them on their own. And so that's a big part of it. The other very big part, as you can imagine, is the music and the dance. And the music is remarkable. Some of you know this. I showed this. This is actually the Smithsonian Folkways of Puerto Rican music in Hawaii. There are many wonderful bands of Puerto Rican locals who play they're just great musicians. They play guitar, they play cuatro, and they just play great music. A lot of it seems to be a carryover from the 20s and 30s. I mean, there's Hebrew music and maybe things that you don't even hear in Puerto Rico anymore. There's stories of. There was a bar in the Kalihi district where Puerto Ricans used to live in the 30s and 40s of Ayala's Bar, and every Saturday there'd be great music and dancing and so on there. And they also have influenced Puerto Rican music has influenced local Hawaiian music to an extent. There's we got this from an authoritative source. There's a couple of John Ortiz, but one of them is a great musician, and he told us how Willie Kay, who's a local Hawaiian musician, has brought in a lot of distinctly Puerto Rican music into his Hawaiian music. So the music is a major part of ethnic Puerto Rican contribution to local culture, and of course we have to talk about Nancy Ortiz. She's a dear friend. She runs a radio show that if you're ever there, you want to hear it. It's called Alma Latina, and for over 25 years, maybe more, maybe 35, she's been playing this music. And right now, what she does is she has a salsa venue in the is it the Ala Moana Hotel? Every Saturday night, and so she sponsors dances and people learn salsa. And she plays all kinds of music. And I should say that just last weekend there was a Latino Heritage Festival, and she was very proud of it. She managed to get it's an annual event for the last 3 years, and this year they extended it to 2 days. That's partly a reflection of the increase in other Latinos arriving in Hawaii, which I'll talk about briefly in a little bit. So it's kind of expanded. It's not just, it's sort of started out with Puerto Rican centered music, and now it's really expanded. Puerto Ricans up until very recently would celebrate Three Kings Day. About 10 years ago, we went to a Catholic church, and we heard a beautiful choir that was preparing just for that day, and then there was at night at the UPRA, which is a big space for meetings and dances and concerts. They had a fiesta. There was dancing and a live band playing there in honor of Three Kings Day. Pictures. Oh boy. Okay. Here's this is the. Did we spell it right? Waipalu. Waipalu. Yeah.
Yes.
Waipalu Cultural Center. And again, if you go to Hawaii, I encourage you to go to the Waipalu Cultural Center. And one of the great sources of pride of the local Puerto Ricans is the casita, and they've decorated it just like when they came over, and have some of the original kitchen utensils and so on inside. And here's two people
Like the one in the Bronx.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And these are women that we work with now.
Yeah. And so they in fact, some of them offer to work as guides, right? They do that, they volunteer. So that's, well, I'll get into that. I mean, in terms of what Hawaii does is they do want to showcase different cultures, and certainly the Puerto Ricans have a distinct presence, and this is one area in which they do. Here's the Three Kings celebration. We know the guy who's playing the guitar there. It's
You know all these people.
what is that called? That's a paseo.
The cuatro, una parranda o
Yeah.
aguinaldo
That's it.
for Christmas. Oh.
So, and of course they have weather is similar to Puerto Rico. It's not like Three Kings in January in New York. So. Here's a band. These guys are almost all Puerto Rican based, and they play kachi kachi music. They're just great musicians. And in fact, the woman with the maracas who's married to the man with the guitar, they consider her kind of an honorary Puerto Rican, right? Because she's
married to Tony
Yeah.
Diaz. Yeah.
But an honorary Puerto Rican is somebody that's really immersed in the food and the music and the culture of Puerto Rico. Baseball was a very important part of Puerto Rican culture. Unfortunately, it's kind of diminished in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. There's a park in the Kalihi neighborhood of Honolulu, and they had lots of leagues. The Puerto Ricans had their own league. The men did. The women had their own leagues. It worked to maintain good relationships among people. It was actually a source of upward mobility for some talented players. Some of the companies would sponsor some of the very good players there. And here's a women's softball team, the Jolly Babes called.
This is around World War II.
Yeah, and the names of some other teams were the Jolly Ricans and the Tainos. So they definitely had a sense of who they were, where they were coming from.
Isn't it interesting?
It's very. And they were, they played well. They took it seriously, and it was a whole league. It was a whole, big involvement for the community. Okay, here's the issue. If we're looking at ethnicity, different ethnicities, so we're looking at Puerto Ricans, then we're looking at local culture, and then we're going to look a little bit at globalization. And Iris and I wrote an article. It was in the journal, the Central Journal, about 10, 11 years ago, and we kind of used this as a schema, as Iris mentioned before. So if you look at what is local culture, and it's a very distinct word and very distinct meaning for people who live there. Generally, it's someone who's lived there over generation two, right? More than one
Born
generation.
and raised there.
Yeah, and they call kama aina. So the people that live there get kama aina rates sometimes for a hotel. Let's say, of course, hotels are expensive and they're mostly for tourists. So if you're a kama aina, you get a better rate, or for some other events too. Iris mentioned that pidgin is a very familiar. Even when people don't speak pidgin, they have a familiarity with the words. So keiki is children. I think that's a Hawaiian word. Onos, it might be a Japanese word, which means delicious. Pupus, we sometimes laugh at pupu, but pupus are appetizers. They say it. Simon is a kind of a noodle dish. Mahalo, everybody says mahalo, which is thank you. The shaka is this. I don't know if you ever see pictures of people in Hawaii. They're always, if you ask them to take a picture, they're always going to go like this. They're always going to. It means hang loose, right? So, and then if you watch Hawaii 5-0, every once in a while they'll sneak in a word. They'll sneak in how's it. The guy will say how's it, or bra is a brother, and so on. Lays are we think of all this sort of touristy stuff, but lays have a lot of meaning. Hawaiian shirts, flip flops, and so on. People remove their shoes. Again, that's an Asian custom that many locals do. Plate lunch. There's a whole local culture of food. There's plate lunches. Sometimes spam. Sometimes you can get 2 scoops of rice. You can get macaroni. But the plate lunches are delicious. A lot of fresh fish, and so on. Poke. I just loved poke. I'd never heard of it before. It's a kind of ceviche. It's like a marinated. The tuna is really ahi is tuna in Japanese, so it's really it's very addictive, but it's delicious. Another very positive feature of local culture is the tremendous amount of intermarriage that's gone on there. People will say that they're chop suey. They'll say they have I'm part Portuguese, I'm part Korean, I'm part Puerto Rican, I'm part whatever. Chinese, yeah. So again, as Iris mentioned, local culture emerged as a result of the various ethnic groups forging alliances out of their common experiences on the plantations, and in many ways resisting the plantation owners. So there's a kind of, if you know, there's a kind of implicit positive social and political value in the idea of local culture. It really is. It's a way that you know, it's almost a prototypical model of how ethnic groups came together and share do evolve a kind of common culture up to a point, and I'll talk about some of the challenges to that. And really, a lot of it comes from the Hawaiians themselves, and that's a whole story about their experience there. But they have Aloha is a real a concept, but it's not just a concept, it's a way of life, and it's the notion of the spirit of sharing and community and acceptance and love and respect, certainly for the earth and the sea and all living beings, and for everybody. So people really do talk about it and try to live it, given the many challenges or conditions that are there for that. Here's some of the challenges, and this is kind of the other level of things, that globalization. The reality is that there are ethnic hierarchies that still exist in Hawaii with respect to power and status. So, it's not. I mean, I'm not. There's kind of a side-by-side issue here. Generally, whites and Japanese are at the highest level in terms of economic power and status. So there's some of that going on. We looked at a study by Michael Haas a few years ago. He only had data from 1990, but he used the data and he sort of looked at the hierarchy in terms of different ethnic groups. And at the bottom were Micronesians, Hawaiians, and he did look at Puerto Ricans in terms of demographic issues, in terms of I don't know whether it was education or income. Yeah, and Samoans in terms of the lower strata of Hawaii, it's sad to say that the public schools don't have a good reputation. Generally, they're not very good schools. There are health problems there. There's issues of nutrition and obesity. There are issues of substance abuse. Meth is a serious problem there. There's some homelessness issues there. If you drive around, you'll see tent areas, tent cities there. Obama was very lucky. He went to Punahou. Punahou is probably one of the country's best private schools. It happens to be in Oahu, but the public school in general isn't the best. Now the Puerto Ricans will dispute this kind of data, and they're very quite rightly proud about that. Yes. They say, look, we're at least in the middle of this hierarchy. We don't see it that way. There is some. Haole is a word. It's a controversial word. It literally has meant people without breath. Now, it's been applied to white people generally. Is it applied to local white people? Sometimes, not always. Is it applied often to tourists? Sometimes. Is it applied to often the whites that came over here and exploited the heck out of Hawaii? Very often. I mean, that's sort of the basis of it. There's some sentiment about haoles, and so there, that's an issue. I mean, I'm not casting any judgment about it one way or another. There's some legitimate concern about why people have strong feelings about people that have come to Hawaii and exploited them. In general, which is happening all around the world, but we're seeing it in Hawaii, which to me is like a microcosm of many societies. You have corporatization and globalization. There's a loss of traditional community. I mean, we're seeing this all over. You have more golf courses. The tourist industry has superseded any other kind of practically any other way of making a living. Lots of shopping malls. I mean, it's hard to believe. You think Hawaii, paradise. You see shopping malls. You have federal highways that have huge traffic jams. you have mass media. You have the same kind of music that you can hear on the mainland there. You just turn the radio. Although, of course, fortunately, you do hear lovely Hawaiian music as well. There's a serious threat to the natural resources there in terms of pollution and the overall quality of the towns and the communities. I mean, that's just unfortunate, and people are struggling with that and challenging that. I just want to mention the sovereignty movement very briefly. This from our understanding is that it arose around the 1970s. To some extent, it paralleled some of the civil rights movement, and these were Hawaiians who take a tremendous pride in their own heritage. They would define themselves as having to have at least 1/8 Polynesian ancestry, and the movement has to do with government land. So that's an ongoing movement that people have different feelings about. So that's part of the whole picture there. I wanted to introduce to some of you. Some of you may know this. There are parallels between some parallels between Puerto Rico and Hawaii's history. We had the pleasure of meeting a graduate student at the University of Hawaii named Rebecca Garrison, and what she did was she did oral histories comparing. There was a movement that ended in I think it was 1990 in Kaho'olawe, where the military was bombing, using this relatively depopulated island for bombing practices, and the locals there got together and challenged that. And of course, you all know in Vieques, which finally happened in 2003, and people have made that parallel. And she did this wonderful study, and she even has a short video, which we won't have time to show, but there's the YouTube. It doesn't really get into the details. She has a couple of interviews, but she has a local from Hawaii talking about how wonderful that people in Vieques were able to get together and do this. And then she has in Spanish, she interviewed a doctor in Vieques and talking about the movement in Hawaii. So it was very thrilling for us to see that, very exciting connection. And currently we have a friend on the I think it's Skye. I always get it confused. It's the windward side of the island, at the west side, where there's the Makua Valley, and he's been leading an anti-military movement called Malama Makua that opposes the army using the Makua Valley in Oahu for bombing practices as well. So you can see there's already a lot of some parallels in that area, and there's always the potential for finding common ground there and for working together. Let me just continue with the local Puerto Rican culture. And they will call it the pilgrimage. In 1973, Raymond Pagan organized a small pilgrimage to Puerto Rico. It took them a few more years to get to the really big one, and they love talking about it to this day. They were very proud of it with good reason. In 1985, a number of these organized local Puerto Ricans went to Puerto Rico. They went there. They were welcomed with open arms. The governor of Puerto Rico greeted them. Everywhere they went, they went to the towns they came from. They found relatives. They were wined and dined, and the state of Hawaii actually supported that. There were some funds from the state of Hawaii for the local Puerto Ricans to go to Puerto Rico. They dedicated a plaque that's still there. If you go to Guanica, you can see the plaque that honored the first 5,203 Puerto Ricans who left to go to Hawaii in 1901, and Tanilaus Diaz wrote a poem. It's in Spanish. We only have the English here, but that's what he said, and it's just a very moving thing. If you're there, if you get a chance to see it. Here's some pictures. Let's see. Is that clear? Yeah. Okay. So that's the 1985. Singing at the dedication ceremonies.
That's Blaise right there,
Blaise,
Susa Camacho.
Right, Blaise Camacho Sousa, who graciously dedicated her archives to the Centro here. She has some very valuable archives about the Puerto Rican community in Hawaii. There's some people playing the cuatro, the guiro, or giro, I should say. I'm sorry. The giro, isn't it? Okay, and this is Sonny Morales. He's famous for making cuatros. He lives on the Big Island. Here he is. I don't want to get it, I don't know enough about the whole controversy over the,
He's just famous for,
he's
an
famous,
artist
famous.
and
Yeah, no,
he's
I
an
was gonna
artist.
mention, because the Big Island triggered me about the coquilles.
Well, we could get to that.
We'll
yeah.
talk about the
Yeah.
coquilles another time.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's the 1985 entourage.
Can you imagine? Wow.
So they were absolutely thrilled. I mean,
John Colon and Raymond Pagan, these are the two people we probably know the best out of this group here.
What emotion.
yeah, it really was profound. They're
It
just
was so emotional, so
yeah.
emotional.
And they do have, I think, did Blaze come up with a little kind of commemorative book? This little, I don't know whether you
Yeah.
can get that from UPRA or, I would think that the Centro here would have one. Yeah, they're playing here also in Puerto Rico. Other
Did
people.
any of them find family members?
I believe they
Some
did.
of them
I
did,
think
and
they
it
did.
was very,
Yep.
very
Yep.
emotional. And that was the first time that many of them had gone there.
Yeah.
And it was
yeah,
organized by the Puerto Rican Heritage Society,
Right,
Yeah.
with Blaze and,
Blaze and Faith Evans.
Faith Evans,
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Yep, they did a wonderful job. Then here's some more people, okay. That's they live on the Big Island, which is also called, Hawaii, which is called the Big Island.
And Tony Laus is the one who wrote the plaque for Guanica,
Yes,
the home.
The
So,
gentleman on the right.
and that's his wife and their son, Tony
He
Diaz.
just died a few years ago. Well, no, he died a while ago.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I want to take a look.
Okay.
And then they did a wonderful thing in 2000. They commemorated the 100 years of their ancestors coming to Hawaii from Puerto Rico, and they developed a centennial. The centennial for a whole year. They got funding from the state of Hawaii, and they all during the year they had different events leading up to, in December, a huge gala at a hotel with food and dance and music and all that. But during the year they had different events with Puerto Rican music and the food and folklore and so on. Oh yeah, that's soon. Okay, I don't know if I'm gonna. All right, let me move on here a little bit. This is the committee. Nancy Ortiz is the one with the in the front with the Hawaiian. What would you call that? It's a work of art. It's a symbol. And then Faith Evans is in the middle. She was the chair. Okay, I'm going to move on a little bit.
Yeah.
I want to just summarize a little bit, and then we're going to play the video, right? We're going to okay. What we're noticing is, it's moved from a plantation to a kind of a industrial to a tourist economy, and so we're seeing a lot of the global marketing issues, even in local income areas, golf courses, higher income, and so on. The local Puerto Ricans do they don't necessarily follow. I was at a party here a few weeks ago, and people say, "Oh, Puerto Ricans in Hawaii, are they independentistas? Are they statehoods?" I said, "Well, they don't exactly follow that, but they certainly follow cultural issues around Puerto Ricans in the United States and so on. I'm sorry, in the mainland. Jennifer López, Ricky Martin, Sonia Sotomayor, they were very proud of that." We noticed, and again, this is just a non-scientific point. We saw that there seems to be a trend, and again, you could say is this a larger trend that's happening to Puerto Ricans or to other Latinos or to other people. Generally, the Catholic Church has been a kind of a bedrock of cultural commonality, and we noticed that more people were going to other denominations. So that, does that kind of reflect on the community? That's a question. Just last weekend, the Latino Heritage Festival is an annual event. It does reflect the growing presence of other Latino groups in Hawaii, mostly from Central America. So there's a kind of a growing pan-Latino presence. Alma Latino, again, as I mentioned, has expanded to more pan-Latino music and calendar. We're pointing out, and this is not a criticism, younger people are less involved in the particular kind of identity politics that they're, understandably, that their parents and grandparents had, and I think that's true across many parts of the United States. Simply because ethnicity doesn't play the same kind of role that it did for their parents or grandparents. There is this pan-ethnic Latino organizing. We think that Aloha and local culture can kind of serve as a resistance, as an alternative to colonization by global capital and culture, and the basis for struggle for integrity of place. I think it's a wonderful thing to hold on to. This is the last panel, and then I think we can do it. This is a little bit. This is again. It's very inconclusive. So that's my point here. There's two challenges that I see. One is that that there is this image that we often get here that Hawaii is this wonderful, harmonious, multicultural society of Aloha, and the point is, it's absolutely a worthwhile vision, but it sometimes becomes a bit of an image or an ideology. And I'm not blaming anybody. I'm saying I think that's just something that's happening. And what I'm saying is, and certainly people acknowledge that. Again, it's sometimes belied by the underlying complex cultural and socio-political factors. I mean, that's they kind of exist side by side. The other point is, very many people desperately, not desperately, they definitely want a positive Puerto Rican image, and they've worked very hard for it. It's there, they've succeeded, and yet again, the reality is, and it's not just simply in Hawaii, that things are changing. That the younger generations don't quite have that sense. Some of them. A number of them do. In fact, on the video, we're going to see young people who are very much identified with Puerto Ricans. So again, I don't want to generalize by any means. But they're emerging Pan-Latino groups, accelerating global processes, different local culture identification. So our point is that the youth are redefining themselves in a way that includes and transcends Puerto Rican culture. It's not one or the other. And so really our goal is to try to understand what's happening, with all the contradictions and all the issues, and work towards an actual multicultural, harmonious, egalitarian society. I mean, I think there are people that want that in Hawaii. We want that here, and the goal is to try to really keep describing a kind of emerging fluid identity that takes what is meaningful about Puerto Rican and other cultures, including local culture, and integrates them at a kind of a synthesized level of awareness, and which I hope will suggest directions for a more evolved integral society. And in many ways, Hawaii is like a prototypical society. I mean, it has this multicultural issue, and yet it's got these overlays of different power and status issues. But it does have this wonderful vision, this way of life of Aloha that I think is an image, is a vision to strive for. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, now we're going to see the video. This is a community organization activity that we organized last year. And what's really interesting about it is that so many of the people that we're working with volunteered to be a part of it, part of the activity. Some of them dance, some of them sing, some of them do other things. You'll see Nancy Ortiz, etc. So you'll get a sense of, and the activity took place in UPRA, the United Puerto Rican Association. So why don't we play that, and then we can open it up to questions.
They don't have a program, right? You were hoping they would.
I don't know, were you able to get a copy of the program? I don't have, Evelyn is here, but anyway, it doesn't matter.
That's okay.
He asked if you were able to get a copy of the program of the community activity, but maybe it wasn't available. It doesn't matter. Why don't we play it, and then we can open it up to questions and comments.
This was January 2010.
It's 25 minutes, the video. Oh, it's going to be with you.
What does it mean to be a local Puerto Rican in Hawaii, with the interchanging of cultures, the influences of technology, and the modern global attitudes, trends, and styles of today? That's what two dedicated academics from New York addressed with an event celebrating 5 generations removed from the arrival of the first Puerto Ricans to the Hawaiian Islands in the early 1900s, who came to work in the sugar plantations. The program began with ubiquitous salutation of the host culture, led by MC Nancy Ortiz.
Can you turn off the lights, maybe?
The event coordinators, Dr. López and Dr. David Forbes of New York City College, explained they were researching the development of local Puerto Ricans given the various layers of influences from Hawaii's multicultural society. Dr. López, who first came to Hawaii in 1994, spoke of her experiences from that visit.
And told me about the history of the plantation village. And I was just fascinated, mesmerized, and meeting these families. One family led to the next, so I really started out by mentioning the Montalvos and the Colons, but the Ortiz family, the Diaz family, the Robles, the Kittlesons, the Figueroas, and I could just go on and on and on. I was amazed about how intact the culture, the Puerto Rican culture, was here, and how it was expressed through the music, the food, celebration of holidays. I mean, we in New York, where I'm from, and they don't celebrate Three Kings Day very much anymore, and you still do it here. So I mean, I thought that was fantastic. The jibaro, the traditional jibaro music. I was fascinated by the ganduli rice and the pasteles that my mother only made once a year, because Puerto Ricans in New York and the mainland only make pasteles once a year.
Dr. Austin Diaz, former chair of the European Languages Department at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, recited from the Decima poems of Carlos Mario Fraticelli, a trained cultured poet who came with the first wave of immigrants.
It's called Somos Boricanos, Boricanos Puros. We are Puerto Ricans, we are true Puerto Ricans. Nosotros nacimos en un rinconcito a donde Colón dio su primer grito. Su nombre bendito nunca lo olvidamos, siempre recordamos su genio y su gloria. Según nuestra historia, somos Boricanos. And that means we were born in a little corner where Columbus let out his first shout. His blessed name we will never forget. We will always remember his spirit and his glory. According to our history, we are Puerto Ricans, Boricanos. No hemos cambiado nuestras diversiones ni nuestras canciones. No hemos olvidado aquel suelo amado de nuestro anciano padre que guardamos en el corazón. Por esta razón somos Boricanos. We have not changed our pastimes nor our songs. We have not forgotten that beloved land of our old father who we protect in our hearts. For this reason, we are Puerto Ricans. Dejamos un día nuestra amada cuna, buscando fortuna en la Oceanía. nosotros amamos nuestra patria hermosa y nuestra alma goza si la recordamos. Por eso cantamos esta, estando seguros que entre de los muros de este honrado hogar suelen habitar borincanos puros. We love our beautiful fatherland and our souls are happy if we remember it. For that reason we sing, being certain that within the walls of this honorable home it is customary for true Puerto Ricans to dwell. I forgot to mention that this is called an aguinaldo. It's a variation of a decima, and in the old tradition, groups of singers went from house to house at Christmas time and sang aguinaldos. Nosotros cantamos versos borinqueños porque no negamos ser puertorriqueños. Nuestros nuevos dueños, los americanos, quieren que aprendamos su baile y su estilo. Y yo siempre digo, somos borincanos. We sing Puerto Rican songs because we don't deny that we are Puerto Ricans. Our new masters, the Americans, want us to learn their dance and their style, and I always say, we are Puerto Ricans. This is my favorite stanza, very emotional. Borinquen querida, luz de mis ensueños, bajo nuevos dueños sufres abatida. La fatal partida de ti recordamos. Si no logramos el volverte a ver, siempre hasta la muerte somos borincanos. Dear Puerto Rico, light of my dreams, under new masters you suffered dejectedly. The ill-fated departure from you we remember, and if we do not succeed in seeing you again, always until death, we are Puerto Ricans.
that the now blended local Puerto Ricans had responded favorably to the event. Puerto Rican Hawaiian Kumuhula Blaine Ikaika Dutro presented his troupe of hula dancers performing an ancient Hawaiian hula.
Blaine is half Puerto Rican and half Hawaiian. This is his mother, and she's completely Puerto Rican.
Born also in Hawaii.
Born in Hawaii.
Yeah.
And her mother is Nancy Ortiz, the DJ. So they've been there for generations,
Yeah.
5 generations.
I think the young men would be interested in the new Taino movements here and in Puerto Rico.
Yes.
Kalani Kahala is my hula teacher's hula teacher. And Kalani Kahala was a very talented individual. He believed in writing his own music and perpetuating the Hawaiian culture. And he was very creative. And the song that we're sharing with you this evening, actually, he put a little bit of a Spanish twist to it. And he added a lot of Spanish words. And the title of the song is Pua Bonita. And he talks about this beautiful lady and compares her to the flower. Yeah, so that's why it's called Pua Bonita.
Bolero hawaiano.
Bolero hawaiano. Isn't that fascinating?
Sí, un bolero,
Fascinating.
estilo bolero, bolero.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating, yeah.
Flor bonita. Fusion.
Yes. Yes. Fusion.
Some of the traditional signature activities of the local Puerto Ricans are no longer part of the community. Dr. David Forbes stressed that the links of the past to the present would inevitably forge the parameters for the future.
So we move from traditional to local, and there's a kind of a third level that's happening, and I know you've experienced it, which is kind of a global level. It's kind of the overlay on the traditional and the local is kind of a global corporate culture in a way. So in a way, all of us are living in various parts at different levels. So the influence of corporate life in terms of going to malls and everybody sort of wearing the same clothes, and I mean, you can go to different parts of the United States and see many different things, and people hear the same kind of music. Technology has been part of that. It's both good and bad. I mean, in one way, it's brought people together. It's enabled people to have a common difference. On the other hand, people can argue that it kind of undermines or destroys or breaks up some dear traditional things that we hold dear, and maybe parts of local culture. So, just briefly, that's the lens that we're looking at, and we're curious to know at the end of the night to have a discussion with you a little bit to see what do you see as the future? What do you think is happening in terms of trends for people's sense of self, sense of like their ethnic identity, their sense of being local, and how the forces that we see that are happening here are affecting us.
The display of dances, poems, ideas, and music were followed by what really keeps a people and its culture alive, and that is its food. Julie Robley then took to the podium.
When our Puerto Ricans came over, they met many challenges. Cooking was not one of them. They brought with them their love. They put their love into everything that they cooked. The other nationalities on plantations came forward, offered them advice because you could not find certain items. There was no culantro de monte, but the Chinese did have their Chinese parsley. There was no plátanos, but we did have an abundance of bananas. They shared, they helped. And that is what makes Hawaii unique. We're not afraid to share, not just our food, not just our music, not just our culture, but who we are as a people. This is a true melting pot. With our food, you come forward, you give a part of you. With the food, we've influenced the local style foods. More spices are used.
and I would say it's more of the Jibaro type of dances, and I think that kind of best describes the Puerto Ricans from Hawaii, those Jibaros, and that's who we are. And so we wear longer skirts, a little bit of a different beat there, a little bit of
From the plantation era of the past to the present, the evening was replete with explanations of the local culture, its dances, its musical instruments, its foods, the development of new words into the vocabulary, and expressions of gratitude for the inspiring contributions of community leaders like Dr. Norma Carr, Faith Evans, and the late Blaise Camacho Souza. At the end, Julie Robley may have said it best.
Many people were very gracious, very generous in sharing their recipes. We did have to pull a few teeth, but I think it was well worth it. For our culture to be preserved in this way, not just for our generation, but hopefully for generations to come, is the most wonderful way to keep us as a people going. Thank
As soon as it turns off, what I'm going to do is kind of see if we can have a discussion.
Yes, yes. In fact, we could turn it off. I don't know how to do that.
No, they'll do it. Okay, so we can start a discussion.
Because it's finishing.
It's about 25 minutes.
Let's go.
It's just practice power.
Yeah. We want some lights and we want,
Does he have credits? Does he have credits?
Gracias. Gracias.
Okay.
That was good. You know, there's been so much that we've seen and heard that we want time, a little bit of time to talk a little bit, to see what questions you have, what comments you have. And I think that, you know, this is definitely anthropological, ethnographic research. And I always said to myself, why is she in the department of sociology? She's anthropology. But it's exciting, it's interesting. I think you had some questions. I think we'd like to, though, you know, given the time, we'd like to see what comments, questions people have, because there is an emotional response. There's also issues as, you know, questions about how big is the Puerto Rican community, and issues of culture transform. You know, there's a lot of very traditional aspects right there, but what I find that really, as a psychologist myself, reminds me how people transform their soul through culture, and how that also is a way of resistance. So it doesn't matter that they've incorporated things, but that's what transformation is, because it's also happening in Puerto Rico and in here.
Right.
So let's open it up for discussion, because, let's see. Identify yourself, because this is from Pregones. He's the director of Aloha, Boricua.
My name is Jorge Merced, and from Pregones Theater, one of the associate artistic directors. And I really want to thank you and commend you for this journey that you've taken us today. It's so well organized and so thoughtful, and so has so many windows for many of us to really dive into it. I only wish that 2 years ago, when I was immersed in the Centro doing my research for the play that we wrote, that I could have had this document already in place at the Centro. But thankfully, the Centro staff guided me through this wonderful world. So, but thank you for this. I have a quick question. Our play showed that there's a lot of interest here in this diaspora about this history. Even today, among younger generations, are really interested in it, to the point that we're bringing the play back again in April.
Yeah.
And I know we sold out all our performances last time, so if you want to see it, just check us out. But at the end of our play, we talked about El Coquí, right? And that's a poetic license that I took particularly, in which, you have generations that perhaps were removed from that experience on a daily basis, and then in the past, 10 years, that just came back up. And in the creation of culture and art, that sound has created music, dances, artists have created, that became like an icon of Puerto Rican hood. As much as the flag is, as much as some songs are, that sound really textured it. And I was wondering, what did you find in terms of the dialogue that's happening with them right now, the fights, of the role that they have in terms of protecting that at all, if at all, given that there's so much pressure to eliminate that pest, as they call it. And I know that in our play we took a license saying, well, they're doing the same thing to the coquí as they did to us when we first arrived in 1900, calling us pillos, revoltoso, pordiosero, the whole thing, and now they're trying to eliminate it. So how was your interaction, your sense of that nowadays?
Do you want to go first?
No, I'm not that up on it.
Right. Well, as you said, Jorge, the coquí was introduced to Hawaii.
Accidentally.
Accidentally. I think a coquí someone either, was bringing vegetables or flowers or something, and it was in there. And it reproduced itself, astronomically in all of the islands, on the Big Island, on Maui, and Oahu, and especially in the areas that are more country. And I think that because there are no predators there that would eat the coquí, they kept multiplying and multiplying. And the beautiful sound that they make when you magnify it in the countryside can be a shrill, it can sound very shrilly to people who are not used to hearing anything or hearing other sounds.
It's just taken on a completely different meaning.
And so that's why people started to talk about it as a pest. It unnerved them to hear this sound at night. When we hear a coquí, right? And it's not, but if you hear it and it continues to come faster and faster and all night long, I think that, we saw some newspaper articles and stuff about, at first we thought it was very amusing, but then we realized that for some people it was a very serious problem on the Big Island especially.
The Big Island.
Yeah, and so, we know people who love it and think it's great that they're there, and then I would say that the majority of the local population that lives in these areas aren't as fond of the coquí as we are.
But
So
I think
yeah.
there's a solution. And the solution is that los coquí in Puerto Rico are beginning to disappear. And I think we need to get
Right, so
the
you have
government
to-
of Hawaii,
exactly. Yeah.
So it's a
okay?
good one.
So just as, some people went to Hawaii many years ago, get our coquís back.
That's right, you can bring them back.
I'm serious.
The
It is
Hawaiian
happening.
coquí now.
Yeah.
It is happening in
Right.
Puerto Rico, and
Yes.
it's serious, and people are very concerned. So we need to figure out, in case you want to put that idea out.
That's good, that's
We will-
good.
Your next grant, okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
The
fine.
preservation of the coquí in Hawaii, right, exactly, yeah.
Eileen.
I really enjoyed the presentation as well as the film. It was quite beautiful. And as a fellow anthropologist, I was kind of thinking about culture and culture change and what stays the same and what doesn't. And what kinds of influences inform what goes on there. And I wondered whether or not you had an opportunity to interview anyone that might have settled there post that initial settlement. So for example, the military officers that came from Puerto Rico who then settled in Hawaii and stayed, or may have come to Hawaii for a certain period of time, but may have interacted with this population and as a result engaged in some cultural exchange.
Yeah.
And then, so that's a question, and then a comment with respect to the Vieques and connection. Also in Guam, a similar kind of movement is taking place, so that the Chamorro are looking at what is happening in Puerto Rico to think about issues having to do with identity and the bombing and the naval bases, and they're also talking to Hawaiians. So there's a red there.
Yes.
And they're really thinking through what's happening in Puerto Rico right now to help the Guam case.
Oh, that's great, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to say something about the military personnel that's there, the Puerto Rican military, Navy people, and then maybe, I don't know if David would like to say anything, but I'm reading some fascinating oral histories that were written probably in the 70s, but they go back to people who were first generation, who actually remember, you know, their grandparents who came, or their parents from Puerto Rico. And I mean, these are the people who lived, sort of grew up in the early part of the 20th century, and it's fascinating. These people are no longer alive, of course, but I was able to get, through the Oral History Institute at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, these incredible oral histories. Wow. And one of the, and that comes to mind because one of the things that this woman, Mary Rios, that's her name, was talking about was how during World War II, the Puerto Ricans who came there, you know, got involved with the women, the local women there, some local Puerto Ricans, other locals of other backgrounds, and had children with them, and she says many, many babies, and that those children stayed there and grew up there. And so, I mean, you know, there is a, first of all, there's a small Puerto Rican population in Hawaii, but part of that population, it's 3.3% of the population, and this is from the 2000 census. Part of that population is also made up of military and Navy personnel. They don't distinguish between the locals who've been there. They count everyone who's there and who says they're Puerto Rican. And so they don't make that kind of a distinction. They don't disaggregate the data in that way. And so, you know, today, for example, a lot of, well, during the 40s and the 50s in the Yalas bar, you had all of these military people there. You know, mixing with the locals, marrying them. A lot of women, a lot of those women who played in the softball team, I was told by Norma Carr, left Hawaii when they married these guys and went back either to the island or to the mainland or someplace else. So I mean, and today, you know, there's a constant mix. Locals are part of the military. Have been in it, you know, it's an avenue, a vehicle of upward mobility for people, just as it is here. And so, you know, there is a constant exchange and mixing and intermarrying, and people, Jose Villa, for example, do you want to say something about him?
He's from, what, the Bronx, wasn't he, or
yeah.
Or Spanish Harlem?
I think Spanish Harlem.
And he's been there for many years, and he's I don't know what the title is. I mean, does he have his own agency? He's a director, or? Well,
he's now he's the head of this whole pan Latino population and group.
Yeah,
mostly corporate people in business and stuff.
He runs a monthly networking sort of cocktail party, and among Latinos, it's great. I mean, it's a kind of pan Latino, but he's interested in promoting the economic well-being of the community, but he's a New Yorican, and he's been there for many years.
And he retired from the Navy, and he stayed there, and he loves it.
Yeah.
And he's been very influential there in terms of, especially, you know, with the younger generation and, you know, people who are more in the business world there. I mean, he's really an important figure there. And so, yes, there has been all of this exchange on all different levels.
Yeah.
We have another, Carmen?
You know, thank you so much. It's been a very moving and emotionally and intellectually stimulating presentation. I would propose that we consider having some kind of major conference in Hawaii, because I don't know how much people know about the Puerto Ricans in Hawaii. I mean, as a Puerto Rican, this has been like an eye-opening. Yes, I knew about it, but the details that you shed light on, I had no idea. And I think there's a need to connect as a people across these waters that separate us. Mm-hmm. And I think Centro would be a great.
That'd be wonderful. That's a wonderful idea.
About this, and maybe this presentation can be the springboard.
The Puerto Rico Studies Association might have its next meeting. We could propose that in Hawaii. Yeah. That would be interesting.
Yeah, it really would.
2 years. That's a very good idea.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A question about the over 5,000 Puerto Ricans. Was that when they started the trip, or that's how many wound up in Hawaii?
That was the first 2 years, 1900 and 1901. Right. 5,000 and a few more immigrated to Hawaii. In 1921, there was
Did they
another.
all make it, is the question.
Oh, well, they didn't all make
Oh,
it.
that's what I'm
Some of
saying.
them,
So-
yeah, they didn't all make it,
Yeah,
no.
okay.
Because
That's how
some
we
of them,
started the trip, okay.
Yeah.
right, they started the trip. Some of them actually escaped. And they stayed in, especially
San Francisco.
California,
San
San
Francisco.
Francisco, yeah.
Then I had a question, I heard once, and I don't know, I read it or something, but that there was some kind of a fund set up by the plantation owners, maybe like pennies a month or something, and that it wound up being some kind of an inheritance or some kind of a, I don't know, endowment. Do you know anything about that? Or-
No, I haven't heard about that. Have you, David?
Hmm.
No.
Let me find out.
But if you
I'll
know
learn
more about it,
that.
maybe you
Yeah,
could let me
let us
know.
know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, your name, please?
Jose Santiago.
Jose.
Where did they recruit from on the island? Was it just in Guanica or all over the island?
No.
Well, Guanica was the port where they left from, right? So that was a departure site. But I think San Ciriaco really affected the entire island, but the mountain area, Yauco, those areas were really devastated. Everything was uprooted. People were left in practically starving. And so I think that a lot of the people there are from the mountain areas, Yauco and the other areas.
Let me say that since that first meeting in 1975, it was 1975, right?
73.
Puerto Rican Hawaiians have been returning to Puerto Rico almost annually in different activities. And I know that because it comes out in the paper, but it's been happening for the last, so there's been since that re-encounter, which was very emotional, we could see, a very interest between Puerto Ricans. I think what would be interesting is diasporic encounters, just like the man that you said that went from El Barrio to Hawaii. I think that amongst the diaspora Boricuas, that would be interesting because the Hawaiian, they call themselves Boriques, have been returning to Hawaii, to Puerto Rico. And I'm almost sure that every year or every 2 years, there's an encounter in Puerto Rico. So that's happening, and interest at the university of having exchange, etc. So now it's like having maybe this la diaspora,
Exactly.
Yeah, and let me just say a word about the Borinqui, that phrase. We initially thought that was a positive phrase and that people liked it. And in fact, I think that a lot of local people call themselves Borinquis and think that it's a good thing.
Yeah.
But if Blaise Camacho Sousa were here, she would scold us because she would say that that's a derogative term, and that and because I think she would say as an academic that it was associated with certain negative things. And she grew up on a plantation. So, I mean, I think it's a really mixed bag. I don't know that there's any real right or wrong because I've heard people use it in so many different ways. And the other point was that Norma Carr is another Puerto Rican from East Harlem that went to Hawaii and wrote the quintessential dissertation on Puerto Rican, the history, she's a historian, on Puerto Ricans in Hawaii. So, I mean, there have been a lot of influences back and forth, as you pointed out.
Hi, I'm Roseni. I'm curious about, I know when they became citizens in 1917, as far as their identification as American, was that ever something that they experienced? And I know that you said that there was some differentiation between them and the Hawaiians that stayed and didn't get statehood until 1959. So from 1917 to 1959, was there any identification with being American versus being Puerto Rican versus being Hawaiian?
Or being local.
Or they were still exploited.
I think there was a real transition, and their attitudes reflected the changes that took place legally and politically. And because I know that certainly during World War II, everyone was very patriotic and felt American, whether it was in Hawaii or here. People were just feeling very patriotic, and I don't think Puerto Ricans were an exception because many of them fought in World War II, so, that second generation that you saw here. But I think that certainly by 1959, that solidified Hawaii becoming a state, their sense of being American, North American. But my perception is that people, their strongest identity is local. It's that is as strong as their ethnic identity. They both are, you can't separate them. And then the American, that's the other layer. And, it's just like us here, we can't separate certain layers in how we feel, and it depends on circumstances, how we negotiate them and how we identify and what we say. And certainly the sovereignty movement, the civil rights movement, all of that brought consciousness to people, and in a different way. And it got played out in Hawaii in a different way than it did on the mainland.
Hi, my name is Coral Sayas, and I'm a bilingual teacher here in New York City. And I was wondering if there are Spanish bilingual schools, if the new generation still use Spanish as a part of their identifying as Puerto Rican. We do hear it in the music a little bit, but are there public schools that teach Spanish, or is it more privately funded by the families, if at all?
Why don't you?
I don't know for sure. We were talking about, there's at certain points, certain ethnic groups will have their own schools. In Queens, the Greeks will have the kids go to school and learn about their culture and speak Greek. I didn't see that, certainly with Puerto Ricans. I don't even think we were seeing it anymore with Japanese or other ethnic groups. Now, in terms of Spanish, it's just being, one of the languages that's taught in school, I'm sure, French, Spanish, and so on. But in terms of a particular purpose of trying to maintain an ethnicity, I didn't see it.
I'd like to add to that a little bit. I thought it was the most fascinating thing when I went to Hawaii, and let's say I was in the countryside, I was on Oahu someplace, and I come across a house, and there's a group of women and men singing and playing in Spanish. And then afterwards I learned they don't speak Spanish. So I think they learned to sing, they learned the words, they know the meaning. I found this time and time again. You heard people, a lot of these guys, they don't speak any Spanish, but yet they were singing in Spanish, and you would think that they were fluent. Some people have learned Spanish. Some people have, depending on their generation and their family situation, like the Montalvos had their mother living with them, and she spoke Pidgin mixed with Spanish, and thank goodness my Spanish is good, because I couldn't understand her Pidgin so much, but I could understand her Spanish, and so, and she was like 95 years old when I met her, and she since has passed. But it's just really, really interesting that there has been a renaissance. I think the Renaissance in part came from the pilgrimage, that 85 pilgrimage that inspired and filled people with so much longing, and they felt that they went back to their roots and made connections and cried, and and everybody just keeps talking about that, and I think that inspired people to learn. But a lot of people still, they're just lip singing mostly. So it's a real variation. It's hard to say. I know there are no schools. And like David said, the Chinese and the Japanese, maybe like 75 years ago, they used to have their children go to Japanese and Chinese schools so that they would learn the language and they learn the culture. I don't think Puerto Ricans ever had that. I don't think they had the funds or the resources to be able to do that. Did you want to?
No, then the question is, in terms of these incoming Latino groups from Central America, is that going to revive
now that's
Spanish,
a different
or
story.
That's a whole other
they
story.
speak Spanish because they're immigrants. So that's a whole other diaspora and a whole other experience, very different from the local. And unfortunately, when things get collapsed, and for whatever reasons, and the history of individual histories that people have and stuff, and they collapse these things, you lose a lot of that. And that's why we are trying so hard to document this. Because, a lot of these people are older and they're dying, and we have met people, many people who have died already because they were older when we met them in the past 10 years. And the younger ones have their own knowledge and their own points of reference, but they don't have the same history. They don't remember, they don't have that collective memory. Some of them do and some of them don't. Kathy Marzan, for example, she's incredible.
She went to Puerto Rico and studied the dance.
Yes, she's the director of the Boricuas de Hawaii dance ensemble, and she went back to Puerto Rico, learned Spanish sometime, I think it was in the 80s or something, learned Spanish, learned the dance, all of the traditional Puerto Rican dances, took it back to Hawaii and taught people that.
In the 90s.
Yes,
That would have been the
amazing.
90s.
Yeah. So, I mean, she's an amazing person, and her family's amazing, and I mean, everyone there is pretty much amazing. I should say that, you know, we would not have been able to do, we organized this activity in 2 weeks, which was like mind-blowing. And if we hadn't had the help of Nancy Ortiz, who knows everyone, I mean, she had us on television, on the radio. She, you know, this group, Joe Rios and Sabor, they volunteered to play the music there.
Everybody volunteered.
Everyone volunteered.
No one was paid.
You know, her grandson, his mother, everyone was there out of the love of, you know, of what we're doing. They felt it was important. Pedro Valdez, who's of Mexican descent, volunteered to videotape it because we really didn't even have money to pay for that. And, you know, luckily I have the raw footage, so we can, you know.
He narrated it.
But he narrated it. And I mean, so it's just like, as Julie Robley said, without the help and the love of all of these people, none of this could have happened. And so, you know, we are just part of it, you know, a galvanizing force, but there are many people there who care about this, who are doing this, and, you know, we're very excited. It's fun, and it's been a terrific experience, and I'm really glad that David joined me in this journey to do this.
I'm lucky.
So,
Well, this has
thank
been
you.
wonderful. This has been Thank you so much to all of you. Please enjoy los piscolabis, you know, and we'd like you to stay and spend some time talking and
And we're available to
writing.
continue this discussion.